let's talk about assessment. There are so many questions around assessment, especially now that the NEP 2020 has been the buzzword for the last 2+ years. Everyone is also trying to think about what is the NEP saying about assessment. So this is a new series and we're going to capture some key ideas, including rubrics and multiple choice questions, competency-based questions and so on, in the subsequent episodes. We're going to begin today's episode, the first one, by talking about what is formative and summative assessment. Of course, you've heard a lot about that, but in my work across, I find that there is still some confusion regarding these two terms, and we might end up doing a lot of summative thinking it is formative. This video is time-stamped, so you can easily navigate to that which is your choice and see that which is of your interest quicker. So it's time-stamped. Towards the end of the video, there is also a story to bring home the point of formative and summative assessment. So do watch till the end and let's begin. This is one of my favorite quotes of Einstein, of course, that not everything that counts in life can really be counted, and assessment is all about counting and marks. And not everything that can be counted ultimately counts in life, So it's not just the marks and grades that will give you super success in life or a satisfied life. It's just a quote that I like, and let's begin. Just a quick check to see what is our own understanding at the moment of these two kinds of assessment, formative and summative. Here are these two girls, Neha and Tanvi, and they are both doing subtraction with borrowing. That's the first hurdle that the students will face in the primary years. So I've taken a very simple example, but my idea is not to teach subtraction, but rather to point out how do we differentiate between these two. Now, I'd like you to focus on the wrong answer. Okay? And of course, clearly the wrong answer is 112. A lot of students would get that. And the right answer is 108. Let's focus on Tanvi, who's got the wrong answer, because the child who's got the right answer, let's leave her for now. What do you think is happening here? Would you say, so I'm wanting you to diagnose really as you're watching my video and think about if you were doing formative assessment, what would you do? If it was summative, you'll say wrong and 0. The idea being that you have taught a lot and ensured that the student now knows how to do subtraction with borrowing and still doesn't get it, and therefore in summative it's a no-go. But if it's a formative, your first step should be diagnosis, and that's exactly what I'm asking you to do as you're watching me illustrate with this example. Would you say that she doesn't know subtraction? I think she does. The idea of subtraction, because she's taking away the smaller number from the larger number. And then, therefore, what is it that she doesn't know? So when your mind works like this, you are actually diagnosing, just the way a doctor diagnoses. The doctors today are treating to the test. They'll ask you to do a lot of tests. That's what our formative tests are. And you go there with the test results and the doctor looks at all the parameters and says, well, maybe it is dengue, maybe it is chikungunya. Of course, RT-PCR is clear COVID positive or negative, but normally the doctor is diagnosing and saying, take this medication and come back after a couple of days. I want to see you again. This is exactly the way the mind of the teacher must work. So formative assessment, when you get something like this, it's a feedback to us as teachers to try and reflect and diagnose what's going wrong. And therefore here you might say, it's not about subtraction. This child probably does not understand the concept of place value and borrowing. Borrowing is also a wrong word mathematics teachers use. Students end up saying, if we borrow something, don't we have to return it? Okay. So she doesn't understand grouping by numbers and doesn't understand how the decimal system works and how the base 10 arithmetic works. That is the way you would diagnose, and that is formative assessment, because here the student therefore doesn't get a 0. The teacher says, I need to work on place value. Okay. So what are some of the objectives of assessment? Let's keep this in our mind. What is formative assessment as shown on the first slide? And we are now talking about why do assessment at all? Where is this requirement? Why not just teach and ensure that the students are learning? Why do we need to bother so much about assessment? But we make it an integral part of our lesson plans and our pedagogy, and that's the way to do it. Because if we teach, we also want to know whether they're getting it. So it is a pedagogical tool, and there are some clear objectives. Now again, this is something I'm opening up all three because it's become a jargon in our world of education, and everybody says, oh, I know what's assessment of learning, for learning, as learning. But we're trying to understand through this first episode, what exactly does that mean? And I'm trying to tell you, and through a story towards the end, how do we make sure that we never really lose sight of our objectives of assessment. Assessment of learning, clearly summative, indicating a final score. Assessment for learning, ongoing and continuous, therefore formative assessment. And assessment as learning, maybe to some of my viewers this may be a new term, but that is indicating self-regulation. And I want to call your attention to the National Education Policy 2020 again, because it's clearly calling out self-regulated learning. And the only way, or one of the ways I think in which this can be possible, is by allowing students to assess their own learning. Therefore, in some other episode of the same series, we will introduce the idea of a rubric to you. Just to capture very briefly, and we'll talk a little bit more in the subsequent slides, summative assessment, summing up of everything, bringing together everything. So everything that you've done that the student knows is summed up, and it kind of gives the outside world, outside of the student, the parents, the other teachers, the other schools, where they want to go, admissions to higher grades and so on, some kind of a verdict, maybe it's a strong word, but some kind of a judgment, or maybe that's also a strong word, but something to tell the outside world, where is this student? 30%, 40%, 80%, 100%, 110%. Also students today are not happy. So it's needed for the movement to another class and so on. Whereas formative assessment, and that's going to be our main concern throughout this series on authentic assessment. Okay? How do we make sure that we are doing our job well when we plan assessments? Okay? Now this answers three important questions. It tells the student, where am I going? That means what is my objective, the final learning outcome that the teacher is expecting. Where am I right now? Because if it's authentic and formative, you are getting a feedback, and then based on that, you're giving a feedback to the student that this is where you are and you need to move further. And how can I close the gap between where I am and where I need to go? That is what is formative assessment. It is also referred to as authentic assessment. Let me explain this diagrammatically, because the brain remembers through pictures and images. So my attempt has always been to create great graphics so that learning is enduring. Assessment of learning, indicating a final score. So we begin with what are the learning objectives or learning outcomes. So we like to, if you've been with us and been watching the rest of our videos even earlier, something which we did in lesson planning, and I can refer to that video up there, which is talking about what is to be taught in terms of how do you craft your objectives. There are concepts, we also deal with misconceptions, then there are skills, there are facts, there are values, there is vocabulary, both academic and incidental. Do go back and check my episode on lesson planning number 1. Then, if it is linear, this is linear. Once you are clear about the learning objectives, then you teach. So how do you teach? The how, the pedagogy, how to teach, which means a lot of teaching strategies, revision, practice. When we were kids, this is what was done all the time. Time-bound revision, time-bound solving the papers and so on. So this is a form of I teach, I practice, and then I go and assess. How do I know whether my students are learning? And which is why Shikshangan likes to call it whether. What to teach? How to teach? How do I know whether my students are getting it? And this is end of the unit, end of the term, end of the year exam. Very, very summative in nature. It's a linear process. Like I said, it's a kind of a judgment, a verdict on where is the student right now. There is no opportunity to go back and correct and change my own teaching, or also help the student to revisit the learning and try to make improvements in their own learning graph. It's a linear one-way process. There's a belief here in this method, an old-fashioned method, that more teaching and more revision of content is an answer to good education. Many of us went through this, more telling. That doesn't necessarily ensure learning. There is no opportunity to go back. Contrast this with what is known as assessment for learning, which is formative, indicating continuous growth. The diagram itself changes the entire entire objective. There it was a linear one-way process. This is a cycle. What to teach? Again, the same thing. How to teach, and how do I know whether my students are learning? As you will see, I'm opening up the same idea of what is what. What are my learning objectives? There are concepts, skills, facts, values, and vocabulary. Vocabulary is both academic and incidental, and there are misconceptions. You must have seen the episode on lesson planning 1, which talks about this in detail. Then I decide how to teach. Now, because this is formative, it is not just teaching and revision and practice. I employ teaching strategies, of course, the teaching methodology, and that is what is pedagogy. If something is going wrong, I diagnose, like we did in the case of Tanvi. Does she not know subtraction? We said. That is the diagnosis which is expected here. Based on the diagnosis, I do remediation. Like the doctor gives you a remedy, I also remediate, but not before I do the diagnosis. Otherwise, I don't know what intervention is required for remediation. After that, I might also think about differentiated teaching in my class, because all my learners have variety of needs and they are at various levels of learning. Then I might also accelerate the teaching for some of the students who I differentiate. And all of these are actually ideas which are path breaking in education. And this is why today we're living in a time where we have so much of research coming in and we know so much better of how to teach. Okay. And then once I've done that, I do continuous comprehensive assessment or evaluation. I use tools of assessment, and throughout the series we are going to be talking about some marvelous tools which ensure authentic assessment. We will be introducing the idea of rubrics to some of you. Others would be familiar, I am sure. But our episode on rubrics will be very, very interesting, which will come up next. And therefore, what is formative assessment? It is ongoing assessment of student learning, like we did in the case of Tanvi. We diagnose, we remediate, we accelerate, and it gives continuous feedback about the performance to whom? Both to the learner as well as to the teacher, and it is a cyclic process. So this diagrammatic representation, I am hoping you will be able to absorb and probably revisit the ideas that you already know. One more way of doing an understanding of similarities and differences between formative and summative assessment, and there is no better tool, no better graphic organizer than a Venn diagram when you want to compare and contrast two ideas which seem to be very similar, and therefore there is a lot of confusion. So formative is assessment for learning, it's a pedagogical process. Summative, assessment of learning, just a moment in time. What do they do know now or not know now? Okay. One is ongoing and diagnostic in nature, and we talked about it. The other is no scope for developmental feedback, end of the year, end of the unit, and so on. But then they are both process of assessments, and therefore in a Venn diagram, at the center, we put in the similarities. Both are ways to assess, both evaluate students effectively, and can be both used for feedback. However, we should focus more on formative, and through that prepare our students to take the summative. This is a lovely analogy again. If summative assessment can be described as a digital snapshot, we're constantly on our mobile phones and shooting, okay. Formative is a streaming video because it gives you moment to moment feedback of what is the student learning, how is the student learning, how can I intervene right now and help the student to learn better. Here is this analogy to remember and a little bit of a story, like I promised at the beginning. Maybe you've heard this, maybe it's new. So this is of course biryani, alright. Suppose you were making biryani in your kitchen. Biryani is a kind of a flavored pulao that we make in our country. So suppose you were making biryani and you are constantly tasting it, right? So we have Shabri in Ramayana who was constantly tasting and giving the berries to Ram. And therefore you're tasting it before you can be sure that this is actually the right way of doing it, and you don't keep it out for your guest on the table before it is perfect. So when you are preparing and when you are constantly tasting, what's the assessment you are doing? You're actually engaging in formative assessment of that biryani. You will never give it to your guest or to your family until it is perfect. Because once it is out on the table, the guest will do the summative assessment. There is no scope of going back and adding or taking away some of the ingredients that you've put in the biryani. So, before summative, you prepare the student very well through the formatives to take the summative, so that there is guaranteed success in the summative. No teacher sends up the child to the summative before proper preparation. Here is one more analogy which will drive the point home. Many of us may be driving a four-wheeler and we learned how to drive that. Every time that an instructor came and he gave us instruction, judgment, gear, wheel, etc., etc., there was formative assessment which was going on. But when you go for the license test, it is summative. You fail or pass. No driving school sends you to a license test until you are completely ready and he is sure that you're going to clear this. That's the job of the teacher. So many formatives we need to do and prepare the students to the summative. In fact, at Shikshangan we recommend, therefore, if you've understood the spirit, and I'm sure you have, and I hope I have been able to do a good job of that there is no reason to give marks in the formative. We just need a feedback and need improving on that. A huge mess we made with formative 1, formative 2, add these 2 marks, add some more marks of summative and then give. If this driver instructor comes to you every day and says, I'm going to give you marks every day for your performance, and all of that will add up for the summative, you're not going to like it, right? Because you'll say, no, I'm still learning. No, I'm still preparing my biryani. Don't come to the kitchen and taste it. Similarly, then, why are we giving marks and grades to the students who are still learning through the formative? So, formative assessment is a pedagogical process where students are still learning, and therefore you need to prepare them. It generates timely student information. It helps you to monitor individual student progress. It helps you to evaluate your own instructional effectiveness. And in terms of what do you monitor the student progress? What does the student know or not know? And how can I intervene and diagnose and then intervene? What the student can do or not do? Know or not know? Conceptual knowledge. Do or not do? Skill-based knowledge. And for the teacher, you modify the instruction. If there's something that you see that you haven't done right, it's feedback to you. That doesn't take away anything from you. It helps us develop better as teachers. It also helps us do differentiated or accelerated teaching. It is therefore imperative to have formative assessment ongoing and comprehensive. Once we understand the spirit of this assessment, we will not label, give marks during formative. We have to understand that the spirit is to prepare the student for the summative. Okay. Thank you for watching. I love what's said here. I see student assessment information as feedback on my own learning as a teacher. Just because teaching took place, it doesn't mean that learning has happened. Thank you for watching. I hope you like what we present through Shikshangan. Do subscribe to our channel. There will be many other episodes coming in this module on assessment. See you.